All right, finally, we're moving past the introduction section. We've talked about titles, we've talked about abstracts, we've talked about the introduction section. Those are all elements that help you get your foot in the door. But of course, there are many other parts of an article too. And so, one of the more important ones that we'll talk about in this course is the method section. And specifically in this video, we're talking about what it is and who you should try to remember when writing the method section. If you're watching this, then you have already seen this video with the various deodorants being tested, and just to kind of have a pretext to talk about a method. That method sections are so idiosyncratic in every individual discipline that this is something that everybody could probably understand. So, keeping in mind that experiment, as it were, and the tools and the participants involved, if you look at this method section, what do you think about it? Is it a good section or why not? And this is the question I asked you to look at and consider. And um, as I'm sure you will agree, there's much more to what happened than what is represented here. So here, just to quickly read it again, if this is section 2, supposing there's an introduction section, then section 2 method, men, 4, were chosen, I think there are more actually, were chosen for the experiment. After playing basketball, each man applied 2 different deodorants, one on each armpit. A young woman was recruited to judge how pleasing the smell of each deodorant was. The female judge smelled each armpit, each time noting her impressions. Her final analysis was then given based on the notes taken. So, as you will have noticed, there are important details here that are missing, such as which deodorants were chosen, um, and other elements, but probably even more important are questions that one would expect to be asked, such as how were these participants recruited? Why were they recruited in the first place? What sort of variables may have influenced the outcomes? So, age, physical activity, um, body hair, and so on. Uh, this here, unfortunately, is representative of it represents a sort of poorly written method section, but it also represents method sections that I've seen in research that has ultimately led to a rejection of an article. Usually, it's not only the method section that does that, but it certainly is one of the sections, if it's poorly written, can weaken the chances of an article getting accepted. And in this case, it's simply a matter of one, including detail that clearly is relevant, and two, anticipating crucial questions that a reviewer would ask. So I asked you to consider what questions about the method need answers. And this is a question that you should be asking yourself when you're writing your articles or your chapters or whatever. As I've mentioned before in this course, one way to get into the habit of doing that or practicing that is becoming a reviewer yourself of manuscripts. This is something that you can talk about with your advisors um, to get involved in that process as somebody who has to look at manuscripts critically, and you'll notice that the method is a very important section of an article. And that can maybe help you get into the habit of questions, anticipating questions that will be asked. So, taking a couple of steps back to our old sort of hourglass-shaped article, where I've kind of tried to stress throughout that in an IMRAD structure and the various permutations that exist within that structure, there is a connection. And um, we want to look at in this particular point of the course how it may connect to the introduction section and what makes a good method section to begin with. And a lot of that is related to anticipating this naysayer, the person who will look at your article very critically, and basically that comes down to just about every reviewer on the planet. Now, a kind of disclaimer here that I'm focusing on the methods section, but not every article has a method section. There are many articles that don't have a specific method section, but the ability to defend your method is relevant to everyone. So even if you don't have a method section, the method by which you're deriving your argumentation, the method by which you've conducted your research, whatever it may be, you need to be able to be clear and come and be forthcoming about that information and make those points relevant to the reader and clear to the reader. And so this, even if you don't write in a genre typically that involves an IMRAD structure with a clear-cut method section, this is something that you'll find that I'm talking about today that you'll find is relevant, basically irrespective of the discipline in which you're writing. And good writers will always kind of keep this in mind as they write, well, every section, but definitely the method section as well. And just a quick recap on some studies that we saw at the beginning of the course, looking at why manuscripts get rejected. And in that context, back in the beginning when we were talking, when these studies that I'm about to talk about again were cited, they were in the context of, does English make a difference? Does writing in English make a difference, or to what extent does language influence the chances of an article getting accepted or rejected? And the conclusion we came to with these, at least these studies, is that never is the English language specifically pointed to as the most important deciding factor of a rejection. Usually, it's perhaps when it is mentioned, it's among a kind of plethora of complexity of other problematic issues that cause an article to be rejected. And if we look at those articles again, those studies again, we see that is definitely the case. Where although in the Belcher study you had reviews with negative commentary, this on articles submitted to the journal TESOL Quarterly, I believe, that were, or I can't remember the journal actually. It was Durham Second Language Writing actually. But in any case, those articles from countries that Diane Belcher defined as being from the periphery, those articles that were rejected and received negative commentary, 90% of those comments involved language use and style. But we also noted, again, this was way back in the beginning of the course, that there were other issues. You can see in this column here, other issues that were strong. And among those, particularly sort of second place to comments that related to language, was this. Issues with the methods and the research design. This is clear, as I stressed earlier in the course as well, with that sort of pyramid, where there are maybe at least three layers of an article that can ultimately lead to success or rejection, which is language, discourse, and the research itself. Research forming the base of the pyramid. If that design of the research is poor, then obviously all of the data that you arrive at from that design are artifacts of a poorly designed research study. And there's no writing in the world that's going to help that. But if you do have a good design or a decent design, and you structure your method section well, then that is something that can work towards your favor, and we'll be talking about that. Likewise, in the Sullivan 2002 article with the professional nursing, this was an important element as well. Too little information about the method, or the method includes serious flaws. So with this here, this last part here, the, a method that includes serious flaws, well, that's something that, writing is not going to be able to help a lot, because if it's clear to the reviewer that you have a flawed method, then the whole research basically just falls apart, the whole pyramid. But if there's too little information about the method, if then that can weaken your article, but it won't lead to failure necessarily. So we're going to talk about how to, the point of this, one main point of this video is how that information is important. Pearson 2004 in the Journal of Respiratory Care. Similarly, inadequate description of the methods, a clear contributor to a manuscript not being published. McKercher and colleagues in the Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Research. The number one issue, according to that analysis, methodology. 74% of manuscripts being rejected, mentioning issues with the methodology or the method section. Right. And so what we see is that the method section is definitely one of the reasons that ticks all the boxes. All of the studies that I cited mention a faulty method. So here is an example of a manuscript report, a review that I just a small part of the review that I conducted for a manuscript that I received that was ultimately rejected. And I just want to kind of quickly read this with you because I think it serves as a good example of what I'm talking about. So here I wrote, I found the article to be well written and with a mostly clear purpose. Unfortunately, there's a disconnect between what the research questions portend and what the paper ultimately delivers. One of the problems is to do with methodology. First, there's very little transparency. We know that the authors sample from 98 English medium journals indexed by Cielo. Well, we do not learn much about Cielo, nor why it was chosen for this study. Further, the authors report that 7 subject areas were ultimately included in the corpus, but we do not know anything about why these subject areas were chosen, the sample size of each, nor even the size of the corpus as a whole. The method section then abruptly skips to the results and discussion section with many questions left unanswered. And so, I mean, this was not the only reason why the article was rejected, and as is the case in most research, there was more than one reviewer. But this was an important point. And one thing I want to point out is this very first point that I make, which is I found the article to be well written. Well, it's true. I mean, the article was well written in the sense that the prose itself was fine. There were no issues with punctuation or spelling or anything like that, grammar. The article was clearly well proofread. Whether the journal article, or rather the journal authors did that themselves, or had the help of perhaps a professional agency, who knows? The point is, no matter how clearly or rather well written in terms of being error-free the article was, that didn't make any difference in terms of my interpretation, my judgment about this issue with the method section, which was also the finding of the other reviewer, who I don't know who it was. And here you have it with there is very little explanation of things, why they do, why they chose the material they chose for analysis, and just very little transparency, which kind of gets reviewers to begin to think, well, what are they hiding here? Why are they not being forthcoming about what they did? There may be no reason at all, but the very role of being a reviewer requires one to be as critical as possible. And I know that sounds kind of mean, but to take it to sort of extreme or very clear-cut cases of, for example, in the medical sciences, if you're dealing with a new pharmaceutical drug intervention, and you want to know that the reporting on that before it is widely adopted and ultimately distributed among the wider population, that the science behind it has passed through a particular rigor. And so, even though this particular study, it probably won't lead to anybody having any sort of serious health effects if I rejected it or not, that's not the point. The point is that the reviewer's role is to be as critical as possible. And if that's the case, they are sort of hypersensitive in many cases. I know that I am very critical when I read manuscripts to question these things, and I know I'm not the only one. And so the authors were ultimately not able to deal with these issues, not able to answer these questions to the satisfaction of the reviewers. And as I've showed you before, this is an example of a a kind of form that we are asked to fill out as reviewers of manuscripts. This one from the journal TESOL Quarterly. And as I pointed out before, this first question here is key. But one of the very important points that we have to say yes to is this one. And as you can see for this particular article, I think this was ultimately rejection, is no. And it's not that if the method is a poor design necessarily, but are they comprehensively described? Is there enough information to be able to decide as a reviewer or even a reader of the article that the data are meaningful, that the results are meaningful, or to be able to interpret what the meaning is of the results that arise from the method? Again, any results arrived at are ultimately an artifact of the method that produced them. And so in order to be able to understand what the results mean, you have to be able to understand the method. And that would then lead to this next question, is to be able to answer this question: are the interpretations and conclusions justified by the results? We would need to understand also the method section. And as we'll see later in a later module, the discussion section then is predicated on the strength as well of the method section, and the results, of course. So next we're going to look at how does that method section connect to the rest of an article.